My name is Claire. I am 33 years old and I was falling from the second floor terrace of the Grand Plaza Hotel. The cold night air whipped past my face, and the last thing I heard before gravity took over was my mother-in-law screaming that my unborn babies were a $10 million scam. When my body finally slammed into the landscaping below, I did not cry. Instead, as the pain ripped through my ribs, I looked up at the stone pillar above and smiled. I smiled because she had no idea she had just walked right into the trap I set. Before I continue this story, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit like and subscribe if you have ever had a mother-in-law from hell. You will want to hear exactly how I destroyed her. I work as a forensic accountant. My job is to track down missing millions for corporate clients, uncover hidden offshore accounts, and catch pathological liars. I analyze data for a living. I do not rely on emotions. But nothing could have prepared my analytical brain for the sheer evil living inside my husband Nathan's family. Nathan is 34 and the CEO of a tech startup, but his real wealth comes from his late grandfather. There is a $10 million trust fund that activates fully the moment Nathan produces a biological heir. Until then, his mother Beatrice controls a significant portion of the interest. Beatrice is a woman who wears designer clothes and lives in a massive suburban estate. When I happily announced my pregnancy at our family dinner earlier that evening, I expected fake smiles and forced congratulations. I did not expect her to corner me on the dimly lit terrace. The argument escalated quickly. She backed me against the decorative glass railing. Her eyes were wild, her expensive perfume suffocating me, as she jabbed a manicured finger into my shoulder. She called me a calculator-punching gold digger. She hissed that she knew the pregnancy was a fake, a desperate ploy to lock her out of the trust fund and steal her lifestyle. I stayed calm, which only enraged her more. I told her the truth always comes out in the audit, Beatrice. That was the trigger. She shoved me with both hands. The heavy glass pane behind me, which I had noticed was dangerously loose earlier that evening, gave way with a sickening crack. Her screaming accusations about the $10 million faded into the chaotic sound of shattering glass as I tipped backward into the dark void. I plummeted past the string lights and crashed violently into the dense, mature palm trees bordering the hotel patio. The thick fronds whipped against my skin, slowing my descent just enough before I hit the damp earth. Agony flared in my side. I tasted copper in my mouth. For a terrifying second, all I could think about were the two tiny lives growing inside me. But as I lay there gasping for air, I forced my eyes open. I looked straight up at the edge of the terrace, where Beatrice was peering over the broken railing. Right next to her, tucked discreetly behind a stone gargoyle, was a blinking red light. It was the high-definition hidden camera I had installed hours before the dinner. I smiled. I had her. The courtyard doors burst open. Nathan came sprinting across the lawn, his face pale with absolute terror. He dropped to his knees in the dirt beside me, his hands hovering over my body, afraid to touch me and cause more damage. He shouted for an ambulance, his voice cracking with panic. But before I could even assure him that I was alive, Beatrice appeared. She had rushed down the sweeping staircase, completely bypassing the hotel staff. She threw herself onto the grass next to Nathan and immediately began her performance. She grabbed his arm, tears streaming down her face. She wailed loudly enough for the gathering crowd of wealthy dinner guests to hear. She cried out that I had become hysterical, that I had threatened to ruin the family, and that I had deliberately thrown myself against the glass to frame her. I tried to speak, to tell Nathan to look at her hands, but a sharp pain in my chest cut off my breath. Loud sirens pierced the night air as the paramedics swarmed the courtyard. They strapped a neck collar on me and hoisted me onto a stretcher. As they wheeled me away, I turned my head just enough to see Nathan looking torn and confused. Beatrice clung to his suit jacket, already whispering poison into his ear, planting the seed of doubt. The game had officially begun. The harsh fluorescent lights of the emergency room blurred into a continuous white streak above me as the paramedics rushed my stretcher through the double swinging doors. The pain in my ribs was a blinding fire with every single breath. Nurses swarmed around me, their hands moving with practiced efficiency as they cut away my ruined evening gown and attached cold, sticky monitors to my chest. A blood pressure cuff squeezed my arm. Someone inserted an intravenous line into my vein. My only focus was the rhythmic beeping of the fetal heart monitor. I needed to hear 2 strong beats. I needed my twins to be safe. But before the medical staff could give me any answers, the unmistakable sound of Beatrice crying echoed down the hospital corridor. They had placed me in a trauma bay, right near the entrance of the ward. Only a thin fabric curtain separated me from the hallway. I closed my eyes and focused my hearing. My forensic training had taught me to always listen to the narrative the suspect builds when they think they are safe. 2 local police officers had arrived to take statements about the incident at the hotel. Beatrice did not waste a single second. She launched into a performance worthy of an Academy Award. She wept loudly, telling the officers how traumatic it was for her to witness such a terrible tragedy. She claimed I had been acting erratic all evening, picking fights and making delusional accusations out of nowhere. Then came her absolute masterpiece. She told the police that I climbed onto the railing myself. She said I looked her dead in the eye, threatened to ruin her life, and simply let myself fall backward into the dark. I lay frozen on the hospital bed, listening to the sheer audacity of her lies. One of the officers asked about a motive. Why would a pregnant woman intentionally throw herself off a balcony? Beatrice sniffled, her voice trembling with perfectly manufactured sorrow. She told them I was obsessed with money. She said I knew that Nathan's $10 million trust fund would finally unlock when the babies were born, and I wanted to ensure she got nothing. She raised her voice, making sure Nathan and everyone else in the waiting area could hear her next words clearly. She told the officers that I was a manipulative sociopath. She said I only married her son for the massive payout. She practically spat the words as she told them my profession. She said I was a forensic accountant, a woman who spends her life twisting numbers and manufacturing evidence to destroy companies. She yelled that I was just a calculator punching gold digger who knew exactly how to stage a crime scene and manipulate the legal system to get what I wanted. She insisted I faked the fall to have her arrested so I could have sole control over Nathan and his massive fortune. I waited for Nathan to shut her down. I waited for my husband, the man who had slept beside me for 3 years, to defend his wife and his unborn children. The silence in the hallway stretched on. When Nathan finally spoke, his voice was small and hesitant. He told the officers that I had been under a lot of stress lately with the pregnancy. He admitted we had argued about finances recently. He actually validated her narrative. Instead of telling the police that his mother was a violent liar, he offered them a reason to doubt my sanity. He said he did not know what to believe anymore. That was the moment my marriage truly ended. The physical pain from the fall was nothing compared to the cold realization washing over me. Nathan was not a partner. He was a coward. He was a man so thoroughly brainwashed by his mother that he would let her rewrite reality while his wife lay bleeding in a hospital bed. I did not shed a single tear. My mind immediately shifted from victim mode into auditor mode. I began compiling the data. I cataloged his betrayal. I analyzed the legal implications of Beatrice's statement to the police. She had just provided a recorded official statement lying about a crime. That was another felony I could add to my growing arsenal. The police thanked them for their time and told them to wait in the family room. The hallway grew quiet again. I stared up at the ceiling tiles, calculating my next move. I needed my lawyer. I needed Jamal. Most importantly, I needed the footage safely downloaded. The curtain rings scraped sharply across the metal rod. I turned my head as Dr. Evans stepped into my trauma bay. He did not have the comforting smile of a doctor delivering good news. He pulled off his gloves, holding a thick medical chart in his hands. His expression was incredibly grim, and the way he looked at me made the blood freeze in my veins. Nathan pushed his way through the curtain right behind Dr. Evans. He looked frantic, his eyes darting from the monitors to my bruised face. Beatrice hovered outside the fabric barrier, her shadow stretched across the linoleum floor, trying to eavesdrop. Dr. Evans ignored Nathan, stepping close to my bed and looking directly into my eyes. He asked about my pain level. I told him I just needed to know about the babies. I emphasized the plural. Dr. Evans let out a slow breath. He opened the plastic chart. He told me my fall resulted in 3 fractured ribs, a concussion, and deep tissue bruising. He said I was incredibly lucky that the dense palm fronds broke my momentum. Then he paused. He looked at the ultrasound printout clipped to the folder. He said the gestational sacs were fully intact. He confirmed both fetal heartbeats were strong. The twins were perfectly safe. A sharp gasp echoed from the other side of the curtain. Beatrice had heard him. 2 babies meant the trust fund was doubly secured, and her control was slipping away fast. Nathan exhaled a massive sigh of relief, dropping his face into his hands. He muttered a quick thank you and reached out to hold my arm. But Dr. Evans did not smile. He pulled his hand away from the chart. He looked at Nathan, then back to me with a flat expression. He stated that surviving the fall was a miracle, but the physical impact was not the reason he was so concerned. Nathan raised his head in sudden confusion. Dr. Evans explained that standard protocol for pregnant trauma patients involves a comprehensive toxicology screening. They need to ensure no internal distress is affecting the fetuses. He flipped to the second page of the file. He pointed a heavy silver pen at a series of highlighted numbers on the lab report. He said the laboratory rushed the results because they found severe anomalies in my blood work. The numbers did not make sense for a healthy 33-year-old woman. My liver enzymes were highly elevated, and my white blood cell count was erratic. As a forensic accountant, I knew exactly what an anomaly meant. It meant hidden data. It meant someone was tampering with the ledger, siphoning resources quietly so the victim would never notice until the system collapsed. I asked him what the lab found. Dr. Evans lowered his voice. He said they found trace amounts of 2 dangerous substances in my system. The first was arsenic. He explained it was a low dose, not enough to kill an adult immediately, but enough to cause severe nausea, intense cramping, and systemic weakness. I instantly thought back to the past month. I had been horribly sick, barely able to keep solid food down. Nathan and his mother had repeatedly brushed it off as severe morning sickness. Beatrice had even insisted on making me special herbal teas every night to calm my stomach. But the doctor was not finished. He took another step closer to my bed. He said the arsenic was troubling, but the second substance triggered an automatic hospital mandate to involve the authorities. He told us my blood tested positive for misoprostol. My mind raced. I knew exactly what that medication was. It is a powerful drug used to induce labor or cause a medical abortion. The doctor stated the concentration levels indicated a steady, consistent exposure over the last 4 weeks. It was a sustained chemical attack. Nathan staggered backward as if he had been punched. He stared at the doctor in sheer disbelief. He stuttered, asking how those specific drugs could possibly get into my body. He tried to rationalize it, asking if it could be a mistake from the lab or a bad reaction to my prenatal vitamins. Dr. Evans shook his head firmly. He said this was not an accident and it was not a mistake. These chemicals were deliberately and maliciously introduced into my system. All of the missing puzzle pieces finally slammed together in my analytical mind with absolutely terrifying clarity. Those bitter nightly herbal teas, the green organic smoothies Beatrice insisted on personally blending for me every single morning while Nathan was in the shower, the way she always watched me drink every drop. She did not just push me off that balcony in blind rage. The fall was only a desperate backup plan because her primary method was taking too long. The real plan had been in motion for a month. She had been methodically poisoning me right under my own roof. She was trying to force a miscarriage to protect her access to the $10 million trust. I stared at the curtain. Someone had been trying to murder my babies long before the fall. The silence in the trauma bay was deafening following Dr. Evans's revelation. He did not wait for our shock to subside before informing us that hospital protocol required him to contact the police immediately. Suspected poisoning was a criminal matter. Within 20 minutes, 2 detectives from the Major Crimes Unit pushed their way through the emergency room doors. They introduced themselves as Detective Ramirez and Detective Carter. They pulled back the privacy curtain and stood at the foot of my bed. They asked Dr. Evans to brief them on the toxicology report. As the detectives listened to the details about the arsenic and the abortion drugs, I watched Beatrice. A normal person would look horrified. A normal mother-in-law would be sickened by the thought of someone trying to kill her unborn grandchildren. Beatrice simply looked calculating. Her eyes darted around the room as her mind worked furiously to rewrite the script she had just lost control over. She realized her simple story about a hysterical woman jumping off a balcony was no longer going to work. She needed a new angle to explain the poison in my blood, and she found it with terrifying speed. Before Detective Ramirez could even ask his first question, Beatrice let out a loud theatrical gasp and covered her mouth with both hands. She rushed to the side of my bed, looking down at me with an expression of absolute fake horror. She cried out, asking me what I had done to myself. She looked at the detectives with tears streaming down her face and told them it all made sense now. She was brilliant at playing the victim, and now she was weaponizing my own career against me. She said I had been acting incredibly secretive for the past 2 months. She claimed I was always locking my phone, taking private calls in the garage, and spending suspicious hours away from the house under the guise of working late on forensic audits. Detective Carter pulled out a notepad and asked her what she was implying. Beatrice did not hesitate. She turned to Nathan and placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. She told the police that I was having an affair. She spun a vile, elaborate lie right there in the emergency room. She claimed that I knew the twins were not Nathan's biological children. According to her twisted narrative, I was terrified that once the babies were born, a simple paternity test would expose my infidelity and cost me access to the $10 million trust fund. She looked the detectives dead in the eye and delivered her killing blow. She told them I must have bought the abortion pills myself from the dark web to get rid of the evidence before Nathan could find out. She claimed the arsenic was probably just a cheap toxic filler used in whatever unregulated black market drugs I had purchased. She wove the poisoning and the fall into one seamless story. She told the police that during our argument on the hotel terrace, she had confronted me about the suspected affair. She claimed that in my desperate, drug-addled state of panic over being exposed, I chose to throw myself over the railing rather than face the truth. It was a masterful pivot. It was so cohesive and so maliciously logical that I actually saw Detective Ramirez stop writing and look at me with a flicker of suspicion. They are trained to look for the simplest explanation, and an unfaithful wife trying to cover her tracks by faking a miscarriage is a classic true crime trope. I did not waste my breath screaming at her. I did not cry. Crying makes you look guilty or unstable. I kept my heart rate steady on the monitor and turned my gaze to my husband. This was the defining moment. This was the moment where Nathan had to step up. He knew my work schedule. He knew I was at the firm poring over spreadsheets because he had visited my office during those late hours. He knew we had been trying for a baby for years and how desperately I wanted this pregnancy. All he had to do was tell the detectives his mother was lying. Detective Carter turned to Nathan, his pen poised over the paper. He asked Nathan directly if there was any reason to believe I was unfaithful, or if I had expressed any desire to terminate the pregnancy. I stared at Nathan, waiting for the immediate denial. I waited for him to defend my honor and the lives of our children. But Nathan looked away from me. He stared down at the scuffed linoleum floor. His hands trembled as he shoved them into his pockets. He shifted his weight nervously. He took a slow, deep breath, avoiding my eyes completely. He hesitated. And in that agonizing, endless second of silence, my entire world fractured. When he finally opened his mouth, his voice was barely a whisper. He told the detectives that we had been having some marital issues lately. The first crack in our marriage had just become a canyon. The first crack in our marriage had just become a canyon. The two detectives scribbled furiously in their notebooks, their expressions hardening as they absorbed Nathan's devastating words. My own husband had just handed them the exact motive they needed to explain the poison in my veins. I looked over at Beatrice. She did not even try to hide the triumphant smirk pulling at the corners of her mouth. She had won the opening battle. She had successfully planted the seed of reasonable doubt right in the middle of a police investigation, and she had used my spineless husband to do it. The fetal heart monitors next to my bed beeped, in a steady, agonizing rhythm, a sharp contrast to the chaotic storm of betrayal raging inside my head. Dr. Evans stood frozen near the door, uncomfortable with the domestic nightmare unfolding in his trauma bay. I knew I needed to take control of the narrative, but before I could formulate a legal strategy to counter her lies, the heavy hospital doors swung violently open once again. My sister-in-law Olivia stormed into the emergency room like a hurricane. She was 30 years old, dressed in her typical oversized designer activewear, gripping an iced coffee in one hand and a thick manila envelope in the other. Olivia had always been Beatrice's shadow, a loud, entitled woman who lacked her mother's dark cunning but made up for it with pure malice. She marched straight past the police officers, completely ignoring the solemn hospital environment and the fact that I was lying battered on a hospital bed. She went right to her mother, exchanging a knowing glance before turning her hostile gaze to me. Olivia sneered, her voice echoing loudly off the tiled walls, demanding to know if the pathetic performance was finally over. Nathan tried to step between us, weakly raising a hand and asking his sister to calm down and respect the police presence. But Olivia aggressively shoved his arm aside. She was on a mission clearly dispatched earlier by Beatrice to gather ammunition while we were trapped waiting in the hospital. She stepped forward and slammed the heavy manila envelope violently onto the edge of my bed. The metal clasp broke open upon impact, and dozens of papers spilled across the white thermal blankets covering my legs. I recognized the official medical letterhead immediately. They were my private, deeply personal medical records from a fertility clinic I had visited 5 years ago. Olivia pointed a sharp acrylic nail at the scattered documents, turning to the detectives with a theatrical flair. She told them they needed to look at those files before they believed a single word coming out of my mouth. She yelled that I was a pathological liar who was physically incapable of carrying a child to term. She brought up the darkest, most painful chapter of my entire life, my miscarriage from 5 years ago, throwing it into the crowded room like a hand grenade. She loudly announced to the police officers that I was barren. She claimed my uterus was scarred and completely useless, quoting a twisted, exaggerated version of a doctor's consultation I had confidentially shared with the family years ago. Olivia shrieked that there were no twins. She accused me of faking the entire pregnancy, just to secure my permanent claim on the $10 million trust fund before Nathan could file for divorce. She said I had intentionally staged the fall from the hotel terrace as a desperate distraction, because my fake due date was rapidly approaching, and I had no babies to produce. Her voice was shrill, cutting through the heavy silence of the trauma bay. She called me a psycho, a con artist who was willing to destroy their pristine family reputation just to maintain my luxurious lifestyle. I looked down at the confidential medical papers scattered across my fractured ribs. They had violated my privacy, broken into my locked home office, and stolen my medical history while I was bleeding in the dirt. I slowly looked at Nathan. He was staring at the floor again, perfectly silent, allowing his vile sister to weaponize the tragic loss of our first unborn child against me. Beatrice stood proudly behind Olivia, her hands clasped delicately together, playing the role of the tragic matriarch, watching her family fall apart. The detectives looked from the stolen papers to me, clearly trying to process this massive influx of chaotic information. But I did not scream. I did not defend my fertility or beg them to look at the ultrasound. I did not waste my breath trying to convince a coward, a thief, and a fool. I slowly turned my head away from the toxic spectacle playing out at the foot of my bed. I looked right past them, making direct, piercing eye contact with the head nurse who had just walked in to check my monitors. I ignored the screaming, the police, and my husband entirely. I spoke in a voice so cold and steady it stopped the room dead in its tracks. I asked the nurse to please pick up the phone and call Jamal Olivia's husband because I needed my lawyer right now. The nurse did not hesitate. The sheer authority in my voice, contrasting with the chaotic screaming of my in-laws, was enough to make her grab the wall phone immediately. Less than 20 minutes later, the heavy emergency room doors swung open again. Jamal walked into the trauma bay. Jamal is 34 years old, a brilliant corporate lawyer, and the only person in this entire miserable family I actually respect. He is a tall, sharp-featured African-American man who always carries an aura of absolute competence. He was wearing a perfectly tailored charcoal suit, clearly having rushed straight from his downtown office. From the moment he married Olivia 3 years ago, I knew he saw right through Beatrice's facade. He tolerated the family dinners out of obligation, but his eyes always betrayed his exhaustion with their endless toxic drama. We were the two outsiders, the ones who married into this mess, and we shared a silent, mutual understanding. As Jamal stepped into the room, he took one look at the scattered medical files on my bed, my bruised face, and the two police detectives standing nearby. His jaw clenched tight. Olivia immediately ran toward him, grabbing his arm and launching into her hysterical narrative. She started screeching about my fake pregnancy, the stolen medical files, and how I was trying to frame her mother. Jamal did not even look at her. He gently but firmly detached her manicured hands from his expensive suit jacket. He stepped past his wife, past Beatrice, and past Nathan, walking directly to the side of my hospital bed. He looked down at me with genuine concern, taking in the monitors and the bandages. He asked me if I was okay, ignoring the circus happening behind him. I nodded slightly, fighting through the burning pain in my ribs, and told him the babies were safe. A flicker of relief crossed his face. Then he turned around to face the room. The transformation was instant. He went from a concerned brother-in-law to a ruthless corporate attorney. He demanded to know what on earth was going on and why confidential medical documents were scattered across a crime scene. Detective Ramirez started to explain, but Beatrice interrupted, trying to play the grieving, victimized mother once again. She stepped forward, dabbing her dry eyes, and told Jamal that I was unwell and making terrible accusations. Jamal held up a single hand, stopping her mid-sentence. He told Beatrice that anything she said to him could and would be used against her, and advised her to remain completely silent. The sheer legal ice in his voice made Beatrice step back, her mouth snapping shut in shock. Jamal then turned to the detectives. He introduced himself as my legal counsel. He politely but firmly requested that the room be cleared immediately so he could consult with his client in private. He pointed out that the presence of hostile family members holding stolen medical records was a gross violation of hospital protocol and highly inappropriate during an active police inquiry. The detectives quickly agreed. They told Nathan, Olivia, and Beatrice to step out into the waiting area immediately. Nathan looked at me one last time, his eyes pleading for some kind of reassurance, but I turned my face away. I had nothing left to say to him. Olivia huffed angrily, grabbing her designer bag, and followed her mother out of the bay. The detectives pulled the heavy fabric curtain shut behind them, leaving Jamal and me completely alone. The moment the curtain closed, Jamal let out a heavy sigh, rubbing his temples in frustration. He looked at me and asked what the hell had really happened at that hotel. I did not waste time with tears or long emotional explanations. I needed to move fast before Beatrice could destroy any more financial evidence. I reached under the thick thermal blanket, wincing as the movement pulled my fractured ribs. I slipped my hand inside my ruined bra and pulled out a small black encrypted flash drive. I had grabbed it from my home office safe right before we left for the hotel dinner, acting on a gut instinct that things were about to escalate tonight. I held the small piece of metal out to him. Jamal looked at it, his eyes narrowing slightly. He knew my profession perfectly well. He knew that when a forensic accountant hands you an encrypted drive, it is essentially a loaded weapon. I told him this was not an accident, and it was not a sudden argument. I explained that his mother-in-law had been poisoning me for weeks, and when that failed, she tried to kill me to protect the $10 million trust fund. Jamal took the drive, his expression turning dangerously cold as the reality of her actions set in. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered my instructions. Decode this, Jamal. Look at Beatrice's offshore accounts. Jamal took the black flash drive and gave me a single firm nod. He instantly understood exactly what was at stake. He simply turned around, pulled a sleek silver laptop from his leather briefcase, and placed it on the small rolling table next to my hospital bed. I leaned my head back against the stiff hospital pillow and finally closed my eyes. The adrenaline keeping me conscious began to crash, replaced by the burning agony of my fractured ribs. But I forced myself to stay awake. I listened to the sharp, rhythmic clicking of Jamal typing on his keyboard. That sound was my lifeline. He quietly asked for the decryption key. I recited a complex string of letters and numbers I had memorized months ago. A soft chime from his laptop confirmed the drive was unlocked. Even with my eyes closed, I could hear the subtle change in Jamal's breathing as my forensic files populated on his screen. He was a corporate lawyer accustomed to reviewing high-level financial mergers, but what I had compiled was a masterpiece of digital tracking. I had spent countless late nights bypassing Beatrice's weak passwords and tracing her hidden financial footprint across multiple continents. Jamal started reading the summaries I had prepared. He muttered under his breath as he opened the first folder labeled Cayman Holdings. He told me he was looking at a maze of shell companies. Beatrice had always projected the image of a flawless suburban matriarch, a woman whose biggest worry was choosing the right caterer for a charity gala. But the data told a terrifyingly different story. Jamal's voice grew tight as he clicked through the spreadsheets. He announced that she was completely broke. Her designer wardrobe and her luxury cars were a massive house of cards built on extreme debt. He kept scrolling, his legal mind quickly connecting the hidden dots I had laid out. He found the massive gaping hole in her finances. It was not just reckless credit card spending, it was gambling. High-stakes, unregulated offshore gambling syndicates. Jamal read the numbers aloud, his tone shifting from professional curiosity to absolute shock. He confirmed that Beatrice was currently $3 million in debt to people who do not forgive loans. She had secretly taken out a second mortgage on her pristine estate, drained her personal savings, and was desperately moving money between dummy accounts to hide the bleeding from Nathan. But the financial ruin was only the beginning. Jamal clicked into the second master folder, the one containing my analysis of her cryptocurrency transactions. I opened my eyes and watched his face. The glow from the laptop screen illuminated his sharp features as he traced the digital currency from her hidden accounts to a series of encrypted dark web marketplaces. He cross-referenced the transaction dates with the timeline of my sudden mysterious illness. The digital ledger was perfectly clear. Jamal read the itemized receipts out loud. He found the exact Bitcoin transfers used to purchase industrial-grade arsenic and black-market misoprostol. The dates matched perfectly with the days Beatrice started insisting on making my nightly herbal teas and morning smoothies. The murder weapon was not a bloody knife. It was a string of alphanumeric characters buried in a blockchain, and I had captured every single digit. Jamal stared at the screen, the horrific reality of his mother-in-law's actions fully sinking in. She was not just a toxic, manipulative woman. She was a calculated, cold-blooded, attempted murderer. He slowly pushed the laptop away and looked over at me. The emergency room monitors continued their steady beeping, the only sound in the tense silence between us. Jamal leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and synthesized the entire motive. He explained what we both now understood with crystal clarity. It all came back to the late grandfather's $10 million trust fund. Right now, Beatrice received a massive monthly stipend from that trust, which was the only thing keeping her aggressive creditors at bay. But the legal framework of that document was ironclad. Jamal looked at my bruised stomach and delivered the final chilling conclusion. He said the moment Nathan produces a biological heir, the entire trust fully vests to him and his children. Beatrice's access is permanently and irrevocably revoked. If these twins are born, she does not just lose her luxurious lifestyle. She loses her financial shield, her home, and quite possibly her life to the dangerous people she owes $3 million. She threw you off that hotel terrace tonight because you are carrying the one thing that will lock her out of that money forever. Jamal let the silence hang as the horrific reality of his words settled over the room. He looked at the screen one last time, tracing the digital evidence of Beatrice's crimes before closing the lid. He told me he would back up every encrypted file on a secure offline server at his firm. He promised Beatrice would not get away with this. Just as he reached for his briefcase, the door to the trauma bay creaked open. Jamal instantly slid the laptop out of sight. Nathan stood in the doorway. He looked utterly exhausted. His suit was wrinkled, and his hair was a mess from constantly running his hands through it. He looked between Jamal and me nervously. Jamal gave Nathan a cold stare of pure disgust. He picked up his briefcase, told me he would be in touch regarding legal steps, and deliberately bumped Nathan's shoulder as he walked out. We were finally alone. I watched my husband slowly walk toward the foot of my bed. My fractured ribs throbbed with blinding intensity, but the physical pain was absolutely nothing compared to the desperate hope I still clung to. A tiny, foolish part of my soul hoped that with his mother out of the room, Nathan would break down. I wanted him to fall to his knees, take my bruised hand, and apologize for freezing up in front of the police. I desperately wanted him to tell me he knew Beatrice was a manipulative liar and that we were going to protect our unborn babies together. But Nathan did not reach for my hand. He did not ask how my breathing was. He paced back and forth at the edge of the bed, his hands shoved deep into his pockets. He refused to meet my eyes. He started rambling nervously about the detectives. He said they were asking very difficult, probing questions out in the hallway. He talked about how stressful this night had been for his family's reputation and how his mother was out in the waiting room having a severe panic attack. I stared at him, feeling the blood running completely cold in my veins. I calmly asked him if he had told the police the truth. I asked if he told them his mother had violently pushed me. Nathan stopped pacing. He finally looked directly at me, but his expression was not supportive. It was deeply accusing. He let out a long, frustrated sigh that made my stomach turn. He said he did not actually see the push happen. He claimed he only saw me falling backward and his mother screaming for help. He then had the unforgivable audacity to bring up the medical records Olivia had maliciously thrown on my bed. He lowered his voice to a hushed whisper, looking over his shoulder, as if someone might be listening. He said he knew how badly I wanted this pregnancy to be real. He reminded me of how entirely devastated I was 5 years ago when we lost our first baby. He twisted my past trauma, using my deepest grief as a weapon, just like his toxic sister did. He said he knew my job as a forensic accountant was incredibly stressful and that sometimes people snap under extreme pressure. He took a hesitant step closer to the bed, gripping the metal safety rail. His knuckles turned stark white. He looked down at me with a pathetic, pleading expression. He begged me to just be honest with him so he could hire the right lawyers to help me avoid jail time. He asked the ultimate question that would permanently end our marriage. "Claire, did you take those pills? Just tell me the truth." The hospital room seemed to lose all its oxygen instantly. The steady beeping of the fetal heart monitors felt like a ticking bomb. My own husband, the father of the babies fighting for their fragile lives inside me, was asking if I had tried to murder them. He was asking if I had thrown myself off a balcony to cover up a lie. He consciously chose the comforting delusion of his toxic mother over the bleeding reality of his pregnant wife. My heart did not just break in that agonizing moment. It completely shattered, turning into sharp, jagged ice. Any lingering loyalty I held for Nathan evaporated into the sterile air. He was a willing participant in their madness. His weakness had almost cost me my life and the lives of my children. I did not yell at him or try to defend myself against his insane accusations. I simply looked at the pathetic man standing right in front of me and realized cutting off Beatrice was not enough. The gloves were officially off. I realized I had to destroy my husband too. I simply looked at the pathetic man standing right in front of me and realized cutting off Beatrice was not enough. The gloves were officially off. I realized I had to destroy my husband too. I did not scream. I did not throw my water pitcher at his head or defend my character. An auditor never interrupts a subject revealing their true colors. You simply record the data and prepare the penalty. I stared at Nathan with a calmness that clearly unnerved him. His desperate, pleading eyes searched my face for any sign of the loving wife he expected to manipulate, but he found absolutely nothing. I told him his mother pushed me. I said it plainly without a single tremor in my voice. I told him I did not take any pills and that his mother had been slowly poisoning my food for an entire month. Nathan opened his mouth to argue, raising his hands in a placating gesture, but I cut him off instantly. I told him I refused to debate facts with a coward who feared his mommy more than he protected his own children. Nathan stammered, stepping closer to the bed. He tried to reach for my hand again, claiming he just wanted to understand and that we needed to figure out a story that protected the family name. I yanked my arm back so violently that the heart monitors spiked. I ignored the intense pain in my fractured ribs. I pointed my finger directly at the heavy hospital door. I ordered him to get out. My voice was low, carrying a lethal weight that finally pierced through his thick skull. I told him he lost the right to be my husband the moment he lied to the police to protect the woman who tried to murder his babies. Nathan stood frozen, his mouth opening and closing like a suffocating fish. He tried to whisper my name, but I pressed the call button clutched in my hand. I told him if he did not walk out of this room immediately, I would tell the nurses he was threatening me and have security drag him out. The threat worked. Nathan's shoulders slumped in utter defeat. He backed away slowly, his eyes filled with a pathetic mixture of guilt and fear. He turned around and walked out of the trauma bay, the heavy door clicking shut behind him. The moment he was gone, the crushing weight of the silence returned. A lesser woman might have broken down sobbing into her hospital pillow. A lesser woman might have mourned the death of her marriage right there in the sterile room. But I refused to shed a single tear. Crying is a biological response to grief, and I was not grieving. I was planning. I took a slow, painful breath, visualizing my ribcage and the two tiny heartbeats safely secured beneath it. I had to secure their future, and that meant burning their toxic family tree completely to the ash. I reached over to the small plastic tray attached to the bed rails and grabbed my cell phone. The screen was cracked from the fall, but it still functioned perfectly. I bypassed the missed calls from my own frantic friends and dialed Jamal's direct number. He answered on the first ring. I could hear the hum of his car engine in the background. He asked if I was all right and if Nathan was still bothering me. I told Jamal that Nathan was no longer a factor. I told him Nathan had chosen his side and that I was now officially treating my husband as a hostile asset. Jamal let out a low whistle over the speaker. He knew exactly what that meant. As my corporate attorney, he knew how deeply entwined my finances were with Nathan's startup. I told Jamal it was time to initiate Protocol Black. It was a contingency plan I had designed months ago when I first noticed discrepancies in Nathan's accounting software, back when I thought it was just a minor business error and not a family-wide conspiracy. Jamal's voice turned incredibly serious. He pulled his car over to the side of the road. He asked me if I was absolutely sure about this, reminding me that Protocol Black would systematically dismantle the entire financial infrastructure of Nathan's company and expose every single fraudulent transaction Beatrice had made. I told him I had never been more sure of anything in my entire life. I wanted them stripped of everything they valued. Jamal typed rapidly on his laptop, confirming he was accessing the encrypted drive. He asked if he should contact the banks right now to freeze Beatrice's accounts and stop the bleeding. I looked up at the ceiling, a cold smile forming on my bruised face. I told him no. Don't just freeze her accounts, Jamal. Let her think she's winning. Jamal agreed and disconnected the call. The following 4 weeks were a masterclass in strategic silence. I remained in the hospital for another 5 days before being discharged to a secure private apartment Jamal had arranged for me under a corporate alias. I completely ignored Nathan's desperate text messages and pathetic voicemails begging to explain himself. I did not file a police report against Beatrice. I did not publicly demand a divorce. I simply vanished into the shadows, allowing them to believe that their intimidation tactics had successfully terrified me into submission. My fractured ribs slowly began to heal, leaving behind ugly yellow and purple bruises that served as a daily reminder of my mission. Meanwhile, my body continued to change. The twins were growing strong. By the end of the month, a noticeable baby bump had rounded out my figure, a physical manifestation of the $10 million inheritance Beatrice was so desperate to steal. Then came the invitation. It arrived via a formal email from Nathan claiming that his mother wanted to host a peaceful Thanksgiving dinner to officially clear the air and heal the family rift. It was an obvious amateurish trap, but it was exactly the opportunity I had been waiting for. I spent the entire morning going over the final financial dossiers with Jamal. Every shell company was tracked. Every stolen dollar was documented. Protocol Black was fully armed and ready to be detonated. I dressed carefully for the occasion, choosing a fitted emerald green maternity dress that deliberately accentuated my growing stomach. I wanted Beatrice to look directly at the very thing she failed to destroy. I drove myself to their lavish suburban estate. The late November air was crisp and biting as I pulled my car onto the massive circular driveway. The sprawling brick colonial home looked like something straight out of a luxury lifestyle magazine. Warm yellow light spilled from the floor to ceiling windows, illuminating the perfectly manicured hedges and the expensive imported vehicles parked out front. It was the ultimate facade of American wealth and stability, completely hiding the rotting foundation of debt addiction and attempted murder underneath. I took a deep breath, patted my stomach, and walked up the stone steps. I did not bother knocking. I pushed the heavy oak front door open and stepped into the grand foyer. The air inside was thick with the scent of roasted turkey, expensive cinnamon candles, and suffocating tension. The low murmur of conversation in the living room abruptly stopped the second my heels clicked against the marble floor. Nathan was the first to appear in the hallway. He looked terrible. He had lost weight and dark circles shadowed his eyes. He took a hesitant step toward me, his gaze dropping immediately to my very obvious baby bump. He swallowed hard, trying to force a welcoming smile, but he just looked like a terrified prisoner. Olivia walked out right behind him, holding a crystal glass of wine. She looked me up and down with blatant disgust. She did not say a single word of greeting, simply rolling her eyes and taking a slow sip of her drink. I ignored them both. I handed my wool coat to the hired help and walked confidently into the main living area. I was not the frightened, bleeding victim they had left in the hospital a month ago. I was the architect of their impending ruin. And then Beatrice emerged from the kitchen. She was wearing a flawless cream-colored cashmere sweater and an apron that looked completely unused. Her perfectly styled hair and expensive diamonds caught the light of the chandelier. For a fraction of a second, when her eyes landed on the undeniable curve of my stomach, a flash of pure, unadulterated hatred twisted her features. But she recovered instantly. She smoothed her hands over her apron and walked toward me with her arms outstretched. She plastered on a terrifyingly sweet smile, playing the role of the forgiving matriarch to absolute perfection. She welcomed me to their home, telling me how incredibly brave it was of me to show up after everything we had been through. She acted as though the hotel balcony incident was just a minor misunderstanding we were going to politely sweep under the luxury rug. She placed her cold manicured hand directly on my baby bump. I did not flinch. I looked her right in the eyes and smiled back, matching her fake warmth perfectly. Beatrice then gestured elegantly toward the formal dining room at the back of the house. She told me to come inside right now because they had set a special place just for me. Her voice was dripping with manufactured honey, but her eyes were deadly. She had a surprise waiting in the dining room. I followed her into the formal dining room, the heels of my shoes sinking slightly into the expensive Persian rug. The long mahogany table was a picture of Thanksgiving perfection. Crystal water goblets caught the light from the chandelier overhead. A massive golden roasted turkey sat on a silver platter in the center, surrounded by bowls of artisan stuffing and cranberry relish. But my eyes did not linger on the food. My attention immediately locked onto the man sitting casually in the chair that should have been reserved for Jamal. He was in his late 50s, wearing a sharp pinstripe suit that screamed expensive, but his smile was entirely predatory. He did not look like family. He looked like a fixer. Beatrice took her seat at the head of the table, folding her hands elegantly over her linen napkin. She gestured for me to sit directly across from the stranger. Nathan quickly took the chair next to his mother, keeping his eyes firmly glued to his empty porcelain plate. Olivia sat down and poured herself another massive glass of wine, a cruel smirk playing on her lips. I slowly pulled out my chair and sat down, resting my hands defensively over my baby bump. Beatrice did not bother offering me a drink or passing the food. She simply nodded at the man. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, and introduced himself as Richard Thorne. He stated he was Beatrice's personal attorney. He did not speak with the measured professionalism of a corporate lawyer like Jamal. Thorne had the slick, condescending tone of a man who specialized in burying ugly family secrets for rich clients. Without missing a beat, he reached down to the leather briefcase resting by his feet. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents bound in dark blue paper. He placed them on the table and slid them right across the expensive linen cloth, stopping exactly next to the turkey platter. The bold black letters on the front page read Post-Nuptial Agreement and Non-Disclosure Contract. Thorne folded his hands and looked at me as if I were an insect he was about to crush. He explained the terms with a chillingly calm voice. He said the family was prepared to offer me a highly generous exit strategy. According to the document, I would receive a lump sum payment of $200,000 to agree to an uncontested quiet divorce from Nathan. But the money came with two absolute conditions. First, I had to sign an ironclad non-disclosure agreement swearing I would never speak about the balcony incident, the hospital toxicology report, or any allegations against Beatrice to anyone ever again. The second condition was the one that made my blood run entirely cold. Thorne tapped his pen against the paper. He stated that upon the birth of the twins, I would surrender full primary physical and legal custody to Nathan. I would be granted supervised visitation once a month. They were legally trying to buy my silence and steal my children, so Beatrice could permanently secure her access to the $10 million trust. I stared at the thick stack of papers. I asked them if they honestly believed I would ever sell my children to a woman who just tried to murder them. Thorne let out a patronizing sigh. He reached back into his briefcase and pulled out a second, thinner manila folder. He said they anticipated I might be uncooperative, which was why they brought insurance. He opened the folder and spread several glossy photographs and printed emails across the table. They were highly sophisticated fakes. The photos showed a woman who looked exactly like me entering a downtown hotel with a man I did not recognize. The emails were fabricated exchanges outlining a passionate, ongoing affair. Beatrice leaned forward, her eyes gleaming with absolute malice. She told me that if I did not sign those custody papers right now, Thorne would release every single piece of that fabricated evidence to the public. She threatened to send it to the partners at my forensic accounting firm, destroying my professional reputation overnight. She promised to submit it to the family courts, dragging my name through the mud, and ensuring the judge saw me as a lying, adulterous mother who was unfit to raise children. She smiled her terrifyingly sweet smile and told me she would make sure I ended up with nothing. Nathan finally looked up from his plate. His face was pale and slick with sweat. He looked at me with those pathetic, pleading eyes. He begged me to just sign the papers. He said it was the only way to avoid a huge public scandal and keep the family name intact. He told me it was the best thing for everyone. He wanted me to sign away my babies. I stared at Nathan. The cowardice radiating from him was physically repulsive. He was sitting there watching his mother and a lawyer blackmail his pregnant wife with forged documents, and his only concern was avoiding a public scandal. I simply placed my index finger on the legal papers and pushed them slowly back across the mahogany table. I told Thorne his forged emails were laughably amateurish and that any digital forensics expert would tear them apart in under an hour. I looked directly at Beatrice and told her I was leaving. I pushed my chair back, the wooden legs scraping. But Beatrice did not look angry. Her terrifyingly sweet smile widened. She raised her manicured hand gracefully, signaling me to stop. She told me I should sit back down because the evening was far from over. She said the photos and emails were just the appetizers. Thorne leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach with supreme confidence. He stated that documentary evidence can always be debated in family court, which is why they took the liberty of securing a first-hand witness. He claimed they had found the exact person who provided the illegal substances. I froze, my hand still resting on the curved back of my chair. Thorne looked toward the swinging door that led to the kitchen. He called out a name. The heavy wooden door pushed open and a man walked into the formal dining room. He looked entirely out of place in the lavish suburban setting. He wore a faded leather jacket and scuffed heavy boots, shifting his weight nervously as he stood at the very edge of the Persian rug. He was holding a battered canvas messenger bag and actively avoiding any eye contact with me. Beatrice gestured toward him as if presenting a grand prize. She introduced him to the table as Mr. Davis. I noted the deep irony of her using such a formal title for a man she had clearly paid to act like a common criminal. Thorne instructed the man to tell the table exactly what he had already told them in private. The man cleared his throat, reading from a mental script he had obviously rehearsed multiple times in the hallway. He claimed he operated an underground pharmacy fulfilling discreet orders placed on dark web marketplaces. He looked at the floor and stated that 6 weeks ago he received an encrypted message from a user matching my exact internet protocol address. He said the user requested a heavy dose of misoprostol and a specific chemical filler. He then recounted a highly detailed, entirely fabricated story about meeting me in a dimly lit parking garage downtown. He described my car model, my winter coat, and even the exact amount of cash I allegedly handed him in a plain white envelope. He claimed I was frantic, telling him I needed the pills to induce a miscarriage before my husband could find out the babies belonged to someone else. The room fell dead silent after his performance. Olivia let out a loud dramatic gasp, covering her mouth as if she had just heard the most scandalous true crime podcast online. She pointed her wine glass at me, screaming that I was an absolute monster and that she knew I was guilty the moment she saw me lying in the hospital. Beatrice dabbed her perfectly dry eyes with a linen napkin, shaking her head in mock sorrow. She looked at Nathan, telling him how sorry she was that he had to hear this terrible truth from a stranger. I remained standing, calmly analyzing the man in the leather jacket. He was sweating profusely, his hands trembling slightly as he gripped the canvas strap of his bag. He was a cheap actor, probably someone Beatrice found through her shady gambling connections and bribed with a fraction of the money she had stolen. I turned my attention back to the table. Thorne picked up his silver pen and tapped it aggressively against the agreement. He promised that if this went to trial, the media would feed on this story for months. He said I would spend the rest of my life in a federal prison while Nathan raised the twins alone. I looked down at my husband. Nathan was trembling in his seat. The manufactured evidence and the fake witness had broken whatever fragile spine he had left. He reached across the table, his hand shaking violently, and grabbed my wrist. His eyes were red and pleading. He begged me to just sign all the documents right now. He whispered that we could not fight this kind of evidence and that he just wanted it all to end. He begged me to sign it so we could avoid a massive public scandal. I looked down at his trembling hand wrapped around my wrist. The sheer desperation in his grip was pathetic. His skin was pale and a bead of sweat rolled down his forehead. He was not trying to protect me or our unborn children. He was only trying to protect his fragile ego and his comfortable life. I did not yell at him. I simply twisted my arm with enough force to break his hold. His hand fell back onto the table, knocking over his crystal water glass. The ice-cold water spilled rapidly across the expensive white linen cloth, soaking into the forged legal documents Thorne had so confidently presented. Then, I did the one thing none of them expected. I began to laugh. It started as a low chuckle in the back of my throat, but it quickly grew into a full, genuine laugh that echoed off the high ceilings of the formal dining room. The sound was completely devoid of fear. It was the sound of absolute victory. The silence that followed was suffocating. Olivia froze with her wine glass halfway to her mouth. Thorne narrowed his eyes, clearly unsettled by a target who was not breaking down in tears. The fake witness shifted nervously, taking a step backward toward the kitchen door. Beatrice lost her terrifyingly sweet smile. Her jaw tightened, and a flicker of genuine uncertainty flashed in her eyes for the very first time. I slowly pulled my chair back in and sat down. I picked up my heavy silver fork from the table setting. I reached over to the crystal bowl in front of me, scooped up a generous portion of garlic mashed potatoes, and took a slow, deliberate bite. I chewed the food calmly, savoring the rich flavor, while 4 people stared at me as if I had completely lost my mind. I swallowed and placed the fork neatly on the edge of my porcelain plate. I reached into my emerald green maternity clutch, resting on my lap. My fingers wrapped around the small, cold piece of plastic I had brought with me. I told Thorne his presentation was incredibly theatrical. I complimented Beatrice on her ability to find a man desperate enough to commit perjury for a few $1,000s. I looked at the man in the leather jacket and informed him that lying to a federal judge carries a mandatory minimum sentence in a federal penitentiary, and I wondered if Beatrice had included legal representation in his bribe. He swallowed hard, his face draining of all color. I turned my attention back to my mother-in-law. I told her that her fatal flaw was absolute arrogance. She spent so much time plotting and scheming that she completely forgot who she was dealing with. She assumed I was just a quiet, obedient wife who would fold under pressure. She assumed my career was just a title. I told her that forensic accountants do not just look at spreadsheets. We track human behavior. We anticipate the cover-up, and we always secure our data. I pulled my hand out of my clutch. I was holding a sleek black remote control. It was not the remote for their home entertainment system. It was a customized controller Jamal had configured for me earlier that afternoon, linked directly to the secure offline server where we had uploaded everything. I shifted in my chair and turned my body toward the wide archway that connected the formal dining room to the massive living area. I raised my arm and pointed the remote directly at the 85-inch flat-screen television mounted on the custom stone fireplace. Nathan asked me what I was doing, his voice cracking with renewed panic. He told me to put the remote down. I ignored him entirely. I told Beatrice that her fake photos and her paid actor were completely useless against high-definition digital evidence. I told her she should have been far more careful about where she discussed her malicious plans. I pressed the central power button on the remote. The massive television screen instantly flashed to life, illuminating the dark living room with a bright blue glow. A custom menu interface appeared on the screen displaying several large video files. Each file was neatly labeled with a specific date and timestamp. The first file was titled The Grand Plaza Hotel Balcony. The second file was titled The Kitchen Island Midnight. The room fell into an absolute deathly silence. Beatrice gripped the edge of the mahogany table, her knuckles turning stark white. Her arrogant posture completely dissolved, replaced by the rigid terror of a predator realizing it had just stepped into a trap. I kept my finger hovering over the play button, looked her dead in the eye, and delivered the reality check she desperately needed. Did you really think a forensic auditor wouldn't audit her own home? I pressed the select button on the remote, choosing the first file labeled The Grand Plaza Hotel Balcony. The screen blinked black for a fraction of a second before bursting into crisp 4K resolution. The hidden camera I had planted behind the stone gargoyle captured the entire terrace in perfect clarity. The audio kicked in immediately, eliminating the suffocating silence in the dining room. You could hear the faint sound of the jazz band playing inside the hotel, followed by the sharp, aggressive clicking of Beatrice's designer heels as she backed me against the glass railing. Everyone at the mahogany table sat completely frozen. Nathan stared at the massive screen, his mouth hanging open in horror as he watched his mother transform into a monster right before his eyes. The digital version of Beatrice pointed a manicured finger at my chest. Her voice echoed loudly through the living room speakers, completely unhinged and vicious. We all heard her scream that my unborn babies were a $10 million scam. We heard her explicitly state that she would never let a calculator-punching gold digger steal her lifestyle and lock her out of the family trust fund. Thorne, the sleazy lawyer, slowly lowered his silver pen. His professional arrogance vanished instantly. Even a fixer like him knew that crystal-clear audio of a premeditated financial motive was a legal death sentence. Thorne understood that participating in an extortion attempt using forged documents and a paid perjurer, while actively trying to cover up an attempted homicide, would not just get him disbarred. It would put him in a federal holding cell right next to his wealthy client. He looked over at Beatrice with an expression of deep disgust, realizing she had completely lied to him about the existence of hard evidence. Olivia gripped the edge of the table, her wine glass completely forgotten, as she watched the mother she idolized unravel on a massive flat screen. Then came the moment of impact. The video showed me calmly telling Beatrice that the truth always comes out in the audit. On the screen, Beatrice's face twisted into a mask of pure murderous rage. She lunged forward. The camera captured the exact moment she shoved me with both hands. The sickening crack of the heavy glass pane giving way echoed through the house, followed immediately by the terrifying visual of me tumbling backward into the darkness. But the video did not stop there. This was the part I wanted Nathan to see the most. The footage continued to roll after I disappeared over the ledge. It showed Beatrice standing alone on the terrace. She did not scream for help. She did not panic. She slowly leaned over the broken railing and looked down into the dark courtyard. She stood there for a full 10 seconds in complete silence, simply verifying that I had fallen. Only when she heard Nathan screaming from the lawn below did she suddenly clutch her chest, mess up her own hair, and begin her theatrical wailing. I paused the video right on a freeze frame of her calculating cold face peering over the ledge. I turned my attention back to the table. I asked Nathan if he still thought it was a tragic accident. I asked him if he still wanted to talk about protecting the family name. Nathan squeezed his eyes shut and buried his face in his hands, letting out a pathetic, muffled sob. He was finally confronted with the undeniable reality of his own cowardice and his mother's absolute evil. Beatrice was hyperventilating. Her chest heaved rapidly under her cashmere sweater. She tried to speak, but only a raspy, incoherent sound came out of her throat. She looked frantically at Thorne, silently begging her expensive lawyer to fix this impossible situation. But Thorne simply reached across the wet tablecloth, gathered his forged post-nuptial agreement, and shoved it roughly back into his leather briefcase. He knew a sinking ship when he saw one. The fake witness, Mr. Davis, came to the exact same conclusion. He had been standing near the kitchen door watching the 4K footage of a violent attempted murder. The realization that he had just inserted himself into a massive criminal conspiracy finally hit his brain. He was a petty hustler, not an accessory to homicide. He looked at me, his eyes wide with absolute panic. He muttered a string of frantic apologies, stating he wanted absolutely nothing to do with any of this. He clutched his battered canvas messenger bag to his chest and bolted. He abandoned Beatrice, completely ignoring her weak, croaking demands for him to stay. He sprinted through the formal dining room, his heavy boots pounding against the hardwood floor as he headed straight for the grand foyer. He was desperate to reach the front door and escape into the cold November night before the police arrived. He grabbed the heavy brass handle of the front door and yanked it open, but he did not make it outside. He bounced hard against a solid wall of a charcoal gray suit. The fake witness tried to run, but Jamal was blocking the front door. Jamal did not flinch as the man in the leather jacket slammed violently into his broad chest. He simply reached out, grabbed the front of the man's jacket with one strong hand and shoved him backward into the foyer. Jamal kicked the heavy oak door shut behind him and turned the deadbolt with a loud defining click. He looked at the trembling fake witness and calmly advised him to find a comfortable, quiet corner to stand in until the authorities arrived to arrest him. Jamal straightened his charcoal suit jacket, walked past the terrified man, and strolled casually into the formal dining room. He took his rightful place standing right behind my chair, slowly crossing his strong arms over his chest. His towering presence instantly shifted the power dynamic in the room from a hostile ambush to a highly organized and fully controlled execution. I did not even look at the man cowering in the hallway. I kept my eyes entirely focused on Beatrice. Her breathing was ragged, her chest heaving as she stared at the massive television screen in the living room. I raised the remote again. I told her the hotel balcony was just an impulsive act of desperation. I said I was far more interested in her daily routine. I pressed the select button on the second file, the one labeled The Kitchen Island Midnight. The screen shifted from the bright outdoor patio of the hotel to the familiar dark granite surfaces of her own kitchen. The video was shot in crisp night vision, casting a ghostly green hue over the marble countertops and the expensive stainless steel appliances. The glowing digital clock on the stove read 2:15 in the morning. The footage showed Beatrice walking into the frame. She was wearing her silk nightgown, her hair perfectly wrapped. She did not look like a woman sleepwalking or acting out of a sudden burst of emotional rage. She looked incredibly focused. The camera angle was positioned perfectly above the cabinets, capturing every single movement she made on the central island. We watched in absolute silence as the digital version of Beatrice opened the refrigerator and pulled out the specific carton of organic almond milk she insisted on buying strictly for my pregnancy. She set it on the counter. Then she reached deep into the pocket of her silk robe and pulled out a small unmarked plastic bag filled with white pills. Nathan let out a strangled gasp, his hands gripping the edge of the dining table so hard his knuckles looked bruised. The video continued to play out her horrific nightly ritual. She retrieved a heavy marble mortar and pestle from the pantry. She meticulously counted out a specific number of pills from the bag, dropped them into the bowl, and began grinding them into a fine powdery dust. The grinding sound was amplified by the microphone, a harsh scraping noise that filled the entire house. Once the pills were completely pulverized, she opened the almond milk carton and poured the deadly powder directly inside. She replaced the cap, shook the carton vigorously to dissolve the evidence, and placed it right back on the top shelf of the refrigerator. She even wiped down the granite countertop with a damp cloth to ensure she left absolutely no trace behind. The video froze right as she turned off the kitchen light, leaving her face illuminated only by the faint green glow of the night vision lens. I lowered the remote. I looked at Nathan. I asked him if he still thought my severe morning sickness was a normal part of pregnancy. I asked him how it felt to watch his mother prepare a deadly chemical cocktail for his unborn children every night while he slept upstairs. Nathan could not speak. Tears streamed down his face as the sheer magnitude of her betrayal finally broke him. He stared at his mother like she was a complete stranger. Beatrice slammed her hands flat on the mahogany table and shot up from her chair. Her face was red and contorted with sheer panic. She pointed a trembling finger at the screen and started screaming. She yelled that the video was completely fabricated. She shrieked that I was using deep-fake artificial intelligence to frame her for a crime she never committed. She begged Thorne and Olivia to believe the footage was computer-generated, but Jamal stepped forward from behind my chair. He reached inside his tailored suit jacket, pulled out a stack of printed documents and dropped them firmly onto the table. He looked Beatrice in the eye and told her she could blame artificial intelligence all she wanted, but she could not fake the international bank wires. Jamal stepped forward, leaving the terrified fake witness trembling in the foyer. He walked slowly around the mahogany table, his heavy footsteps echoing in the tense silence. He held a thick stack of glossy black folders under his left arm. He stopped right next to Thorne, who was still frantically trying to pack his briefcase. Jamal dropped the folders onto the table with a loud thud that made Olivia jump in her seat. He suggested the sleazy attorney might want to review actual evidence before trying to blackmail a federal investigator again. He slid one folder directly in front of Nathan and another in front of Beatrice. Jamal calmly instructed everyone to open the files. He said the first 3 pages contained the official SWIFT codes, routing numbers, and cryptographic signatures tracing the exact funds Beatrice used to purchase the arsenic and the abortion drugs. He explained that cryptocurrency mixers and dark web escrow services might hide a buyer from a lazy local detective, but they were absolutely useless against a forensic accountant with direct access to the source network. He looked at Beatrice and told her the money left her personal checking account bounced through 3 offshore shell companies and landed precisely in the digital wallet of the man who sold the poison. Beatrice stared at the documents. Her hands shook violently. She tried to formulate a defense, stammering that her accounts had been hacked, that someone had stolen her identity to frame her. She looked at Nathan, her eyes wide with manufactured desperation, begging him to believe that she was a victim of a sophisticated cybercrime. But Jamal simply laughed. It was a cold, sharp sound. He told her she was wasting her breath because the dark web purchases were actually the smallest and least impressive part of her extensive financial crimes. Jamal leaned forward, resting his strong hands on the back of my chair. He turned his attention entirely to Nathan. He asked my husband if he remembered hiring Beatrice as an unofficial financial advisor for his technology startup 2 years ago. Nathan blinked his mind, struggling to process the rapid shift in conversation. He nodded slowly, his voice a hoarse whisper. He said he brought her on to help manage the initial seed funding because she had connections with wealthy suburban investors. Jamal nodded. He told Nathan that was the biggest mistake of his entire life. Jamal instructed Nathan to turn to page 4 of the black folder. He explained that when I initiated Protocol Black from my hospital bed, I did not just ask him to look into Beatrice's personal debts. I gave him full authorization to audit the entire family portfolio, including the corporate accounts for Nathan's technology firm. Jamal described how Beatrice had systematically constructed a massive, highly sophisticated embezzlement scheme right under her son's nose. Jamal laid out the facts with brutal, legal precision. He explained that Beatrice had set up 5 different dummy corporations registered in Delaware. She used her position as the unofficial advisor to approve fake vendor invoices, funneling company capital directly into those phantom businesses. She forged Nathan's digital signature on dozens of massive transfer authorizations. Jamal told the table that over the last 18 months, she had actively drained exactly $4 million from the startup. She used that stolen corporate money to feed her underground gambling addiction, pay off her loan sharks, and maintain her untouchable suburban facade. Nathan stared at the spreadsheets inside the folder. The color completely drained from his face. His eyes frantically scanned the rows of data, recognizing the fake vendor names and the massive capital outflows he had previously dismissed as high operating costs. He finally understood why his company had been struggling to make payroll for the last 3 months, why their latest round of investor funding had suddenly evaporated, and why I had been working so many late nights trying to make sense of his broken ledgers. His own mother had been bleeding his dream completely dry. Beatrice tried to speak again, her voice a shrill whisper. She claimed she was just borrowing the money temporarily and that she was absolutely going to pay it all back as soon as her new offshore investments cleared the bank. She reached out her trembling hand toward Nathan, desperately trying to touch his suit arm, but he violently recoiled from her touch, as if she were made of pure toxic acid. He looked at his mother with absolute unfiltered hatred. Jamal buttoned his suit jacket, his expression completely devoid of any professional pity. He looked down at my devastated husband, who was still staring blankly at the ruined financial spreadsheets on the table. "By the way," Nathan Jamal said in a deadly quiet voice, "your company is bankrupt." Beatrice drained it. Nathan stared at Jamal with wild, unblinking eyes. The words hit him with physical force. He frantically flipped through the final pages in the glossy black folder, his eyes desperately scanning the bottom lines of the corporate balance sheets. The numbers stared back in unforgiving black and white. His breathing became incredibly rapid and shallow. He began muttering to himself, calculating out loud how he could salvage the wreckage. He talked about taking out a massive personal loan. He suggested liquidating his stock portfolio, selling his luxury cars, and mortgaging the house we were standing in just to make the upcoming payroll. He looked at Jamal and begged him to draft a restructuring plan immediately. He said he needed a few weeks to reorganize the board of directors and stabilize the accounts. I sat quietly and watched my husband scramble to save a kingdom that no longer belonged to him. I took a sip of my water, the ice clinking softly against the crystal glass, and gently placed it back on the mahogany table. I told Nathan to stop talking. My voice was calm and steady, cutting right through his rising panic. I told him he was not going to take out any personal loans, he was not going to liquidate any stock portfolios, and he certainly was not going to reorganize the board of directors. Nathan looked at me with genuine confusion. He wiped the cold sweat from his forehead and asked me what I meant. He said he was the chief executive officer and the primary founder of the company. He insisted he had the absolute legal authority to do whatever it took to save his entire life work from her catastrophic mistakes. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table, and folded my hands together. I asked Nathan to cast his mind back exactly 6 months ago. I reminded him of a particularly stressful week in the spring when his startup was suddenly hit with a massive intellectual property lawsuit from a bitter former vendor. It was a completely frivolous claim, but it terrified him. He had spent days pacing our living room, convinced the vendor was going to freeze his corporate accounts and destroy the company before the new software launch. I reminded him of how he came to me, his brilliant forensic accountant wife, begging for a financial strategy to shield his primary holding company from the impending litigation. Nathan swallowed hard, his eyes darting around the room as the memory surfaced. He nodded slowly. He said he remembered that week vividly. He remembered that I had drawn up a highly complex asset protection strategy to safeguard the corporate structure. I had presented him with a mountain of dense legal paperwork to sign. I smiled warmly at the memory. I told him he was absolutely right. I had drafted the protection strategy, but I asked him if he had actually read the fine print on any of those documents before he rushed to sign the signature lines. Nathan froze. The color drained from his face for the second time that evening. I watched the horrible realization dawn on him. I explained that forensic accountants know exactly how to hide things in plain sight. I told him that among the dozens of liability waivers and asset transfer protocols, there was a single legally binding corporate restructuring agreement. In his desperate panic to protect his company from a fake vendor lawsuit, he had voluntarily signed over the controlling interest of his primary holding company. I looked him dead in the eye and delivered the absolute truth. I told him he no longer owned 51% of the corporate voting shares. I did. I explained that I was the legal majority shareholder of his entire operation. He was essentially just an employee at this point. I pointed out that he had absolutely no authority to sell assets, acquire new debt, or fire any board members without my explicit, written consent. He had handed me the absolute keys to his kingdom because he was too lazy to read the documents and too arrogant to think his quiet wife would ever outsmart him. Nathan slumped back into his expensive dining chair as if someone had physically knocked the wind out of his lungs. He looked down at his hands, realizing they were completely tied. He had lost his mother, his reputation, and now his entire professional empire in the span of an hour. He looked up at me, a broken and empty shell of the man I used to love. I rested my hand gently on my pregnant stomach, feeling the twins shifting inside me. I leaned back in my chair and looked at my terrified husband. I don't just own the trust now, Nathan. I own you. I don't just own the trust now, Nathan. I own you. The absolute finality of my statement hung heavily over the ruined Thanksgiving table. Nathan did not say another word. He simply buried his face in his hands, his shoulders shaking as the reality of his total defeat finally crushed whatever ego he had left. He was a man who had chosen to protect a lie, and the cost of that choice was his entire empire. Beatrice remained frozen in her chair. Her eyes darted wildly around the room, searching for any possible exit or any remaining ally, but she found absolutely nothing. Her expensive lawyer was quietly packing his briefcase, desperate to flee. Her fake witness was already detained in the foyer, and her son was a broken shell. But there was one person left at the table who had not yet fully processed the financial nuke Jamal and I had just detonated. Olivia had been sitting rigidly in her chair, gripping her crystal wineglass so tightly her knuckles were stark white. She stared at the glossy black folders on the table, her mind slowly performing the necessary math. She looked at her mother, then at her brother, and finally at me. The realization hit her like a physical blow. The trust fund was permanently locked away from them. The corporate accounts were drained. The family estate was heavily mortgaged to pay off secret gambling debts. Olivia stood up so fast her heavy wooden dining chair crashed backward onto the Persian rug. The loud thud broke the suffocating silence. She completely ignored me and marched straight toward the head of the table. She stopped right next to Beatrice, her face contorted into a mask of pure, ugly rage. For her entire life, Olivia had been Beatrice's loyal shadow, blindly following her mother's toxic lead because it guaranteed her a life of absolute luxury without a single day of hard work. But loyalty in this family was only ever bought, and the bank account was officially empty. Olivia slammed her hands down on the mahogany table right in front of her mother. She started screaming at the top of her lungs. She demanded to know if it was entirely true. She yelled that she was supposed to inherit half of that estate and a massive portion of the trust fund interest. She shrieked that her entire financial future had been gambled away on illegal offshore betting sites while she was completely in the dark. Beatrice recoiled from her daughter's sudden fury. She reached out her hands, shaking uncontrollably, trying to grab Olivia's arm. She begged Olivia to lower her voice and promised they could fix this if they just stuck together. She said they were family and that they needed to present a united front against me right now. But Olivia violently slapped her mother's hands away. She laughed, a harsh, hysterical sound that echoed off the crystal chandelier. She told Beatrice she did not care about family loyalty. She cared about her credit cards. She screamed that her designer lifestyle, her expensive vacations, and her exclusive country club memberships were all funded by the accounts Beatrice had just completely drained. She pointed a sharp acrylic nail directly into Beatrice's face, calling her a selfish, pathetic thief who had ruined her life. It was a mesmerizing, pathetic spectacle. I sat back in my chair and simply watched them tear each other to absolute shreds. This was the ultimate payoff. I did not need to raise my voice or throw a single punch. The poison they had harbored inside their family dynamics for decades was finally eating them alive. Olivia continued her vicious tirade, bringing up every single secret grievance she had ever held against her mother. She accused Beatrice of always favoring Nathan, of using the family money to buy his affection while leaving her with scraps, and of being a reckless gambling addict who threw their entire legacy away. Beatrice burst into loud theatrical tears, trying to play the victim one last time, but Olivia was entirely immune to the performance. She picked up a full glass of ice water and threw it directly into her mother's face. Beatrice gasped loudly, the cold water ruining her perfect hair and completely soaking her cashmere sweater. Through all of this chaos, Jamal stood perfectly still. He did not intervene to protect his mother-in-law, nor did he try to calm his screaming wife. He simply watched the woman he had married reveal the absolute darkest, greediest depths of her soul. The disguise was completely gone. Olivia did not care that her mother had tried to murder her pregnant sister-in-law. She only cared that the money was gone. Jamal let out a slow, heavy sigh. He stepped away from my chair and walked calmly over to where Olivia was standing. He looked at his wife with pure, unfiltered disgust. Then he reached into the inside pocket of his tailored charcoal suit jacket and handed her a thick white envelope. Olivia stared at the thick white envelope in Jamal's outstretched hand. Water still dripped from her mother's sweater, but the room had grown deathly quiet again. Olivia blinked, her mascara smudged from her earlier screaming fit, and hesitantly took the envelope. She asked what it was, her voice losing its edge and returning to the whiny tone she reserved for getting her way. Jamal did not answer. He gestured for her to open it. She tore the seal with trembling fingers. Her eyes scanned the first page. The color drained from her face, mirroring the exact expression her brother had worn minutes prior. It was a formal petition for dissolution of marriage. Jamal was filing for divorce. Olivia looked up, her mouth falling open in sheer shock. She stammered, asking how he could do this when her family was under attack. She tried to grab his arm, crying real tears this time, telling him she needed her husband to defend her against me. Jamal stepped back smoothly, avoiding her touch with a look of absolute revulsion. He told her he was not her personal shield, and he certainly was not her endless automated teller machine anymore. He explained that when I gave him authorization to initiate Protocol Black and audit the family's corporate structures, he inevitably had to cross-reference the data with their own marital joint accounts. He told her she was just as careless, arrogant, and legally stupid as her mother. Jamal listed her offenses with the detached precision of a seasoned litigator. He told the entire room that over the past 2 years, Olivia had secretly funneled over $300,000 from their joint savings into a private offshore account under her maiden name. But she did not stop there. Jamal pulled out his smartphone and read off a meticulously documented list of luxury expenses. He detailed a 2-week vacation to the Maldives, a diamond bracelet, and a lease for a sports car. He looked her dead in the eye and stated he knew she did not buy those expensive things for herself. He had tracked the payment destinations directly to a 25-year-old personal trainer she had been secretly seeing at her exclusive suburban country club. Olivia gasped loudly, dropping the heavy divorce papers onto the hardwood floor. She frantically tried to deny it, waving her hands in the air. She claimed those were just innocent gifts for a struggling friend, and that the separate account was meant to be a surprise investment fund for their future. Jamal let out a harsh, humorless laugh that echoed off the high ceiling. He told her to save her pathetic lies for the judge. He informed her that as her husband, he had tolerated her endless shopping sprees and her incredibly toxic family dinners because he genuinely believed she was simply immature. But stealing his hard-earned money to fund a secret affair was the absolute final line he would ever let her cross. Jamal leaned in close, his towering frame casting a dark shadow over his terrified wife. His voice dropped to a dangerous, icy whisper. He told her he had already frozen all of their joint financial assets before he even walked into this house tonight. He had filed an emergency legal injunction with the state. He made it perfectly clear that because she had committed deliberate financial fraud against him, his ruthless legal team was going to ensure she walked away from their marriage with absolutely nothing. Her mother's trust fund was permanently gone. Nathan's technology company was completely bankrupt, and now her own marital safety net was entirely shredded. She was going to have to get a minimum wage job. The absolute devastation of the family was finally complete. Beatrice was shivering uncontrollably in her wet clothes, facing years in a federal prison. Nathan was staring blankly at the wall, stripped of his entire professional empire and his dignity. Olivia collapsed to her knees on the expensive Persian rug, sobbing hysterically as she desperately tried to gather the scattered divorce papers. I sat calmly at the mahogany table, my hand resting protectively over my babies, watching their empire of lies crumble into absolute dust. Jamal walked back over to my side, adjusting his suit tie with professional calmness. He looked at me and gave a single highly satisfied nod. We had executed the entire plan flawlessly. Then, cutting through the sound of Olivia's pathetic sobbing and Beatrice's ragged breathing, a new noise pierced the cold November night. It started as a faint wail in the distance, but rapidly grew louder and much more urgent. The flashing bright reflection of red and blue lights began to dance violently across the large living room windows. The sound of police sirens wailing down the driveway. The sound of police sirens wailing down the driveway shattered whatever fragile silence remained in the house. The intense flashing of red and blue lights painted the walls of the grand foyer, casting long shadows across the expensive artwork and the marble floors. Heavy footsteps crunched over the gravel outside, followed immediately by a loud pounding on the heavy oak front door. Olivia stopped sobbing and stared at the entrance in absolute terror. Beatrice jumped, her soaking wet cashmere sweater clinging to her shaking frame. The sheer panic in her eyes was finally real. She was no longer a wealthy suburban matriarch plodding in the shadows. She was a cornered criminal realizing the absolute end had arrived. Jamal did not look surprised. He casually checked his gold wristwatch, adjusting his tailored suit jacket with the calm precision of a man who had orchestrated every single detail. He looked at Beatrice and informed her that he had bypassed the local precinct entirely. He told her he sent the encrypted files, the high-definition video footage, and the international banking wires directly to the Major Crimes Division hours before we even sat down for dinner. The entire Thanksgiving ambush was just a waiting game until the arrest warrants were signed by a judge. Jamal walked past the cowering fake witness in the hallway, reached for the deadbolt, and swung the massive front door wide open. Detective Ramirez and Detective Carter, the exact same officers who questioned us at the hospital, marched into the house. They were flanked by 4 uniformed police officers carrying heavy tactical gear. Ramirez took one look at Mr. Davis, who was pressing himself flat against the foyer wall, and ordered 2 uniforms to place him in handcuffs immediately. The fake witness did not even try to resist. He simply held out his wrists, whimpering quietly, as the cold steel clicked shut. The detective stepped past him and walked straight into the formal dining room. The scene they encountered was a masterpiece of absolute domestic destruction. Forged legal documents floated in spilled ice water. The massive television screen in the living room was still paused on the night vision footage of Beatrice poisoning my almond milk. Olivia was kneeling on the floor, surrounded by divorce papers, and Nathan was sitting at the table, a completely broken man staring blankly into space. Detective Carter stepped forward and locked his eyes on Beatrice. He spoke with the hard, unforgiving voice of the law. He formally announced that Beatrice was being placed under arrest. He listed the charges loudly enough for everyone in the house to hear. The list was incredibly long and devastating. First-degree attempted murder, felony poisoning, corporate embezzlement, extortion, wire fraud. Beatrice completely snapped. The carefully crafted illusion of her perfect upper-class life shattered into a million pieces. She did not surrender gracefully. She went absolutely feral. As one of the uniformed officers reached out to grab her arm, Beatrice let out a blood-curdling scream. She violently swatted the hand of the officer away and lunged backward, crashing into the heavy mahogany table. Her hands scrambled desperately for any kind of weapon. She grabbed a stack of expensive porcelain dinner plates and hurled them directly at the police officers. The plates smashed violently against the wall, sending sharp shards of white porcelain exploding everywhere. She grabbed her heavy crystal water goblet and threw it, narrowly missing the head of Detective Ramirez. It shattered against the hardwood floor. She screamed that she was being framed, that she was a respected member of the community, and that they had absolutely no right to touch her. The officers moved in quickly, entirely unimpressed by her suburban status. 2 large uniforms tackled her from both sides, pinning her arms against the ruined Thanksgiving table. The struggle was violent and incredibly pathetic. Beatrice thrashed wildly, knocking over the silver platter holding the roasted turkey. The lavish meal spilled onto the floor, mixing with the broken crystal and the torn legal documents. The officers forced her hands behind her back, the sharp click of the handcuffs echoing above her hysterical screaming. Throughout the entire physical altercation, Nathan sat perfectly still. He did not stand up. He did not yell at the police. He did not try to protect his mother. He just watched the woman who had controlled his entire life get forcefully pinned down. The officers hauled Beatrice up. Her perfect hair was a tangled mess. Her clothes were soaked with water and gravy. They marched her toward the front door. As they dragged her struggling body into the flashing lights of the foyer, she twisted her neck back. She looked directly at the son she had tried so very desperately to manipulate. Beatrice was dragged out in handcuffs, screaming Nathan's name. The heavy oak front door slammed shut behind the police officers, cutting off Beatrice's frantic screaming. The flashing red and blue lights slowly faded from the foyer walls, leaving the grand suburban house bathed in a cold, heavy silence. Only the distant wail of the police cruisers fading down the long driveway remained a haunting reminder of the absolute destruction that had just occurred. Inside the formal dining room, the scene looked like the aftermath of a violent hurricane. Expensive porcelain plates lay shattered in 100 jagged pieces across the hardwood floor. The roasted turkey rested upside down in a puddle of crystal water and ruined legal documents. Olivia was still curled into a tight ball on the Persian rug, completely paralyzed by the reality of her impending divorce and financial ruin. Jamal stood quietly near the doorway, watching the wreckage with a detached professional satisfaction. He had done his job perfectly. Nathan slowly pushed his chair back and stood up. His legs trembled slightly as if they could barely support his weight. He stared at the empty foyer where his mother had just been dragged away in handcuffs. The illusion of his perfect wealthy family had been violently ripped away, exposing the rotting foundation underneath. He turned his head and looked at the television screen in the living room, which was still paused on the night vision image of his mother poisoning my drink. He looked at the forged post-nuptial agreement soaked in water on the table. The absolute truth finally crashed into his mind. He had chosen to blindly trust a woman who stole his company, who gambled away his legacy, and who tried to murder his pregnant wife. He had almost thrown away his future to avoid confronting his mother's true nature. He turned his attention to me. I was still sitting calmly at the ruined table, my hands resting protectively over my stomach. Nathan took a hesitant step forward, his expensive leather shoes crunching on the broken porcelain. His face was pale and streaked with silent tears. His shoulders slumped, completely devoid of the arrogant posture he usually carried as a chief executive officer. He looked like a lost, terrified child. He took another step, navigating around the spilled food, until he was standing right next to my chair. Then he collapsed. Nathan dropped heavily to his knees, right there amidst the shattered plates and the spilled gravy. He reached out with trembling hands and gently grabbed the fabric of my emerald green maternity dress. He did not dare touch my skin. He looked up at me with red, swollen eyes and began to beg. The words poured out of him in a desperate, pathetic rush. He swore to me that he was completely manipulated. He cried that Beatrice had brainwashed him since childhood, conditioning him to believe protecting the family name was everything. He pleaded that he never truly believed I would fake a pregnancy or hurt the babies. He claimed he was just terrified by the lies she kept whispering into his ear. He tightened his grip on the fabric of my dress, his voice cracking as he continued his desperate plea. He begged for a second chance. He swore he would change. He promised to go to intense therapy to cut off all contact with his toxic family and to spend the rest of his life making it up to me. He looked directly at my growing baby bump and sobbed. He told me he wanted to be a good father to the twins. He begged me not to take his children away. He said we could rebuild the company together since I now own the majority shares. He pleaded with me to let him prove that he could be the strong, protective husband I deserved. I listened to his frantic apologies and his desperate promises. A month ago, these words might have broken my heart. A month ago, I might have cried with him and tried to find a way to fix our shattered marriage. But watching him kneel in the wreckage of his own cowardice, I felt absolutely nothing. The love I once had for him had been entirely extinguished the moment he stood in that hospital room and asked if I had taken the abortion pills. His tears did not move me. His apologies were just empty words from a man who only realized his mistake after he had lost his entire kingdom. I did not pull my dress away from his trembling hands. I did not yell at him or call him pathetic. I simply sat there in the heavy silence. I looked down at him devoid of all emotion. I looked down at him devoid of all emotion. The silence stretched between us thick and suffocating, broken only by the sound of his ragged breathing. I finally pushed my chair back and stood up. The movement forced Nathan to tilt his head back to keep looking at me, his tear-streaked face catching the dim light of the chandelier. I did not offer him my hand. I looked at the man I had pledged my life to and realized I was staring at a stranger. A weak, terrified boy trapped in a man's tailored suit. I told him to stop crying. My voice was perfectly calm, lacking any of the anger or hysteria he probably expected. I told him his tears were entirely useless to me now. I explained that an apology is only valuable when it comes before the destruction, not after the ruins have already settled. He tried to interrupt me, reaching out to grab my dress again, but I took a deliberate step backward. I told him he lost the right to touch me the moment he stood in that hospital trauma bay and asked me if I had taken the abortion pills. Nathan lowered his hands to the floor, his head dropping in shame. I told him I needed him to listen very carefully to what I was about to say, because it would be the very last conversation we would ever have. I recounted the years we spent together, the vows we made, and the trust I had blindly placed in him. I told him that marriage is supposed to be the ultimate partnership, a sanctuary where two people protect each other from the absolute worst the world has to offer. But when the worst came from inside his own house, he folded. I leaned down slightly, making sure my words pierced through his pathetic sobbing. I told him he did not protect me. You didn't protect me. You protected your comfort. You chose the familiar toxic warmth of your mother's lies over the terrifying reality of your wife's survival. You wanted to avoid a public scandal so badly that you were willing to sacrifice my sanity, my reputation, and the lives of our unborn children just to keep your suburban illusion intact. You chose the path of least resistance, Nathan, and that path led you right here to the floor of a shattered dining room. He begged me again, whispering that he could change, that therapy could fix us. I shook my head slowly. I told him there is no therapy in the world that can fix a man who lacks a spine. I informed him that I was filing for a fully contested divorce first thing tomorrow morning. I told him Jamal had already drafted the paperwork outlining my demands for absolute primary physical and legal custody of the twins. I made it explicitly clear that he would never be a father to these children. I told him I would rather raise them completely alone than let them spend a single second around a man who would throw them to the wolves to save his own ego. As for his bankrupt technology company, I told him my legal team would be in touch regarding the corporate restructuring. I owned the majority shares, and I would decide if the company lived or died, but I would never step foot in the same boardroom as him again. He was officially excised from every single aspect of my life, both personal and professional. I was initiating a complete and permanent no-contact order. He was never to call me, text me, or approach me ever again. Nathan let out a broken wail, collapsing completely onto the ruined Persian rug, hiding his face in his hands. I did not feel a single ounce of pity. I raised my left hand and looked at the expensive diamond engagement ring and the platinum wedding band sparkling on my finger. They felt incredibly heavy, like physical shackles tying me to a family of monsters. I grabbed the bands and pulled them off my finger in one swift motion. The metal felt cold as it left my skin. I did not hand the rings back to him. I simply dropped them onto the mahogany table. They landed with a soft splash directly into the overturned crystal bowl, sinking deep into the dark red cranberry sauce. It was a fitting grave for a completely toxic marriage. I turned my back on my sobbing husband and the shattered remains of his family. I walked out of the formal dining room holding my head high. Jamal was waiting for me by the open front door holding my coat. I slipped it on, stepped out into the crisp November air, and walked away without ever looking back. I walked out of the formal dining room holding my head high. Jamal was waiting for me by the open front door holding my coat. I slipped it on, stepped out into the crisp November air, and walked away without ever looking back. That freezing Thanksgiving night was exactly 2 years ago. The transition from a bleeding victim in a hospital bed to the ruthless architect of my own destiny did not happen overnight. It required months of brutal litigation, endless court appearances, and an iron will. But I executed my strategy flawlessly. I took the 51% controlling interest of Nathan's bankrupt technology company and ruthlessly dismantled it. I liquidated every single salvageable asset sold off the software patents and fired his entirely incompetent board of directors. I used that massive influx of capital to launch my own independent forensic accounting firm. Today, I am no longer just an employee punching numbers in a cramped cubicle. I am the chief executive officer of the most feared financial investigation agency in the entire city. I sit behind a massive custom glass desk on the 40th floor of a downtown high-rise. My firm's name is bolted to the lobby wall in heavy brushed steel letters. We specialize in uncovering high-level corporate embezzlement, tracing offshore accounts, and destroying pathological liars. But my greatest achievement is not the multi-million-dollar corporate revenue stream or the corner office with the panoramic city view. My greatest achievement is currently sitting on the plush carpet near the floor-to-ceiling windows. My twins, a beautiful boy and a fierce little girl, are the absolute light of my existence. They are 2 years old, completely healthy, and full of vibrant, chaotic energy. They are completely untouched by the toxic legacy of the family I left behind. They will never know the suffocating manipulation or the cold sting of conditional love that defined their father's life. I secured their $10 million trust fund in an ironclad legal fortress. Nathan filed for personal bankruptcy shortly after our divorce was finalized. He currently lives in a tiny, rented apartment in another state, working a low-level data entry job just to pay his mounting legal debts. He is completely erased from our lives. I smiled as my daughter successfully stacked a wooden block tower and cheered for herself. Above her, a sleek, flat-screen television was mounted to the office wall, quietly playing the local afternoon news broadcast. I usually keep it muted while I review dense financial dossiers, but today I had the volume turned up just enough to hear the anchor's voice clearly. The news anchor was delivering a final update on a high-profile suburban crime saga that had dominated local headlines for the past 2 years. She looked directly into the camera and announced that Beatrice had finally exhausted her endless string of expensive legal appeals. The judge had formally handed down her sentence earlier this morning. The anchor stated the terms clearly: 15 years in a federal penitentiary for attempted murder and massive corporate fraud without any possibility of early parole. The broadcast cut to a brief video clip of Beatrice being escorted out of the district courthouse. Her expensive designer cashmere was gone, completely replaced by a standard-issue orange prison jumpsuit. Her perfectly styled hair was thin and completely gray. She was shackled at the wrists and ankles, looking small, defeated, and entirely stripped of the arrogant suburban power she once wielded like a weapon. She looked straight at the news cameras with hollow, empty eyes before being pushed into the back of a heavily armored transport van. I felt a profound, undeniable sense of closure wash over my entire body. The monster who had smiled at me while secretly pouring poison into my almond milk was finally locked inside a concrete cage. She would spend the rest of her miserable life surrounded by iron bars and cold floors. I picked up the silver remote control resting on my glass desk and turned off the television. The screen instantly faded to black, taking Beatrice and her pathetic ending with it forever. The past was permanently buried. I picked up my favorite pen, ready to sign the final pages of a massive corporate merger audit. My future was bright, secure, and entirely my own. I watched my children laugh together. I looked down at the complex financial spreadsheets, feeling a deep sense of absolute peace. Then a sharp, confident knock echoed against my heavy oak office door. I called out, telling the person to come in. The heavy oak door swung open, and Jamal stepped into my office. He looked sharp, wearing a perfectly tailored navy suit that demanded respect. He was no longer just the corporate lawyer I called from my hospital bed 2 years ago. Today, Jamal is my senior managing partner and the co-founder of this forensic accounting empire. Our partnership is built on absolute mutual respect and a shared understanding of how to dismantle financial predators. There is no lingering trauma between us, only the efficient energy of two professionals who walked through fire and bought the ashes. He walked over to my desk, dropping a folder next to my coffee mug. He wore a satisfied smirk, the kind he only displayed when he cornered a corrupt executive during a deposition. I picked up the folder, asking him if the opposing counsel had folded on the corporate merger we were auditing. Jamal nodded, pulling out a guest chair and sitting down. He told me they completely surrendered. Our financial team had successfully traced their hidden offshore accounts, exposing a tax evasion scheme that gave us absolute leverage. Our firm was about to secure a 7-figure commission from this single settlement alone. I smiled, opening the folder to review his flawless legal structuring. We spent the next several minutes discussing the logistics of the settlement, transferring assets and preparing the final disclosures. We operated like a synchronized machine. I found the hidden numbers and he weaponized them in the courtroom. It was an incredibly satisfying routine. After reviewing the documents, Jamal leaned back and crossed his legs. The strictly professional atmosphere softened just a fraction, allowing a brief moment of personal reflection. He looked over at the twins, who were absorbed in building a fortress out of wooden blocks near the window. A warm smile crossed his face. He told me the kids were getting big, and that my son was starting to look exactly like me. I thanked him, acknowledging how fast time was moving. Jamal let out a soft chuckle, shaking his head, as if remembering an absurd joke. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees, and told me he had an unofficial update regarding his ex-wife. I raised an eyebrow, closing the folder. I had not heard Olivia's name in over a year. After Jamal froze her assets and finalized their aggressive divorce, she had dropped off the map. She had no trust fund to fall back on, and her mother was fighting a losing criminal battle. Jamal told me he was downtown yesterday afternoon, walking through the high-end retail district to grab a coffee. He walked past that expensive designer boutique Olivia used to obsess over, the one where she routinely dropped $10,000 a month using his credit card. He paused for dramatic effect, a wry smile pulling at his mouth. He told me he looked through the glass display window and saw her. She was not shopping. Jamal said Olivia was wearing a cheap black polyester uniform with a plastic name tag pinned to her chest. She was working as a junior retail associate. He described watching her struggle to fold cashmere sweaters on a display table while an angry store manager yelled at her for being slow. The woman who once screamed at her mother for ruining her inheritance was now spending her days steaming wrinkles out of clothes she could no longer afford to buy. I pictured Olivia forced to cater to wealthy women while making minimum wage. A sharp laugh escaped my throat. Jamal joined in, a rich, genuine laugh echoing across my spacious office. It was not a laugh of cruel vengeance, but one of karmic satisfaction. We were treated like disposable outsiders, and now we were sitting in a luxury high-rise, while the people who tried to destroy us were locked in prisons or folding sweaters for an hourly wage. Jamal stood up, adjusting his tie and picking up his briefcase. He told me he had a conference call with clients. He told me to enjoy the victory and walked out the door, clicking it shut. The office grew quiet again, save for the happy babbling of my children. I stood up slowly and walked over to the floor-to-ceiling windows. The afternoon sun was beginning to set, casting a brilliant golden hue across the massive city skyline. Millions of people were rushing through the streets below, living their own complex lives, unaware of the battles fought in the high-rises above them. I placed my hand gently against the cool glass, taking a deep, steadying breath. I raised my other hand and reached up, touching the delicate gold necklace resting against my skin. I raised my other hand and reached up, touching the delicate gold necklace resting against my skin. It was a simple chain holding two interlocking circles representing my twins. It was the only piece of jewelry I wore every single day. The heavy platinum wedding band and the flashy diamond engagement ring Nathan had given me were long gone, resting somewhere at the bottom of a landfill, along with the rest of his family's garbage. I watched my children laugh as their wooden block tower finally collapsed, scattering across the carpet. They were not upset by the destruction. They simply gathered the pieces and immediately began building something new. Children understand intuitively what adults spend a lifetime trying to unlearn. Sometimes you have to let the entire structure fall apart before you can build something that actually stands strong. Society constantly pushes the narrative that family is absolutely everything. We are told from a very young age to forgive, to compromise, and to sweep unforgivable transgressions under the rug in the name of shared blood or marital vows. We are conditioned to believe that setting hard boundaries makes us cold or unreasonable, but blood does not excuse abuse. A marriage certificate does not give anyone the right to poison your food, to steal your financial security, or to demand your complete silence when they physically push you off a ledge. When I look back at that terrifying night falling from the hotel terrace, I do not feel fear anymore. I feel a profound and strange sense of gratitude. If Beatrice had not pushed me, I might have spent the next 20 years living in a beautifully decorated suburban prison. I might have spent decades pretending my husband was a strong partner instead of a pathetic coward who hid behind his mother's skirt to avoid conflict. People often look at my life now and assume my forensic accounting firm, my high-rise office, and my financial independence are an act of elaborate revenge. They think I built this empire purely out of spite to prove a point to the people who underestimated me. But spite is a very weak fuel, and it burns out entirely too fast. I did not build this life to punish Nathan or Beatrice or Olivia. I built this life because it was the only way to guarantee they could never reach me or my children ever again. Losing a toxic family is not actually a loss. It is a necessary amputation to save the rest of the body from infection. The price of gaining my empire was walking away from a lie, and I would pay that price 100 times over. I know Nathan still thinks about me. I know he probably sits in his tiny rented apartment staring at the blank walls, wishing he had just found the courage to stand up for his pregnant wife in that hospital room. I know Beatrice spends her days in a sterile federal penitentiary, realizing that her absolute obsession with a $10 million trust fund ultimately cost her everything she ever valued. They are living in the ruins of their own terrible choices. But their regrets and their misery are not my burden to carry. I am no longer the quiet, obedient auditor who let them control the daily narrative. I am the woman who audited their souls, found them completely morally bankrupt, and permanently liquidated their toxic influence over my life. I turned away from the massive window overlooking the city skyline and walked back to the center of my office. I knelt down on the plush carpet right next to my children. My son handed me a blue wooden block and my daughter handed me a red one. I placed them firmly on the foundation they were building. The office was warm, filled with the sound of pure, innocent joy. This is what actual wealth sounds like. It is the absolute peace of knowing that the people inside your walls are safe and the monsters are permanently locked outside. Thank you for listening to my story. It is a harsh reminder that you should never underestimate a woman who knows exactly how to read the data. Now, I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to cut off toxic family to save yourself? Let me know in the comments below. If my journey resonated with you, please hit the like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories of survival and empowerment. Remember that your peace of mind is your most valuable asset. Protect it at all costs. Claire's harrowing journey from a betrayed wife falling from a hotel terrace to a powerful independent CEO offers a profound lesson about the true nature of personal boundaries. The most critical takeaway from her story is that biological ties and legal vows do not obligate you to endure abuse. Society frequently pushes the narrative that family is everything, conditioning us to forgive endless transgressions and sweep toxic behavior under the rug simply to maintain the illusion of domestic harmony. However, Claire's experience violently dismantles this dangerous myth, teaching us that loyalty should never require the sacrifice of your safety, sanity, or self-worth. When faced with her mother-in-law's calculated malice and her husband's pathetic cowardice, Claire did not attempt to fix them or wait for an apology. She recognized a hard truth: you cannot heal people who are fundamentally committed to manipulating you. The profound lesson here is that walking away from a toxic family is not a defeat or a failure. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation. It takes immense courage to look at the people who are supposed to protect you, realize they are actually your greatest threat, and systematically sever those ties. Claire teaches us that true strength lies in refusing to be a collateral victim to someone else's dysfunction. She lost her marriage and her in-laws, but in doing so, she gained an unbreakable empire of peace for herself and her children. Sometimes, the most loving thing you can do for your future is to let a fundamentally broken structure collapse entirely so you can build something genuine from the ashes. If you are currently sacrificing your own well-being to keep the peace in a toxic environment, I urge you to take the first step toward reclaiming your boundaries today.